Well, good morning. It is awesome to be back with you guys. I am just excited to be here. I love Colorado. I spent most of my summers here growing up, actually in Greeley. That's the place that smells like cow manure if you've ever been there. My grandmother lives there, but it's been just a blast to get to be here with your staff and just the way that you guys treat me with family. Emily and I are so thankful to be here. And I'm actually going to be here again in 2 weeks to talk to you about mental health. So you have that to look forward to. So if you hate my talk today, don't come back in 2 weeks or something. I'm just kidding. Please come back. Anyway, to already kick off a weird conversation that we're going to have today about pornography, obviously, let's just get a pulse in the room. How many of you grew up in church? Okay. A good majority of it. How many of you did not grow up in church? Okay. All right, that's interesting. Cool. You guys are probably a little bit better off, especially if you were growing up like I did, and I'll tell you why. I grew up in the church in the 1980s in the buckle of the Bible Belt, which is Oklahoma. That's a very strange place if you've never been there. But my entire Christian experience in church was very much masked by morality. We were very much of the Southern Baptist flavor and persuasion, which was as long as you didn't drink, you didn't have premarital sex, you didn't do drugs, and you didn't dance, which that one was weird. I mean, you remember the movie Footloose. And I would always challenge the pastors on that. I'd be like, what do you do with David in the scriptures dancing before the Lord? And they're like, just no dancing. So, and then the other big one was you didn't listen to secular music, and there was just one problem. I really loved secular music. I did. It was the heartbeat of my soul. And so I would go to these church camps as a kid growing up, and we'd have fun and games throughout the day. And then in the evening, they would have this very emotional service where they were like, how many of you want to go to heaven with mommy and daddy? How many of you want to burn in hell for eternity? And I was like, I don't know. One kind of outweighs the other. And eventually the band would play for 80 hours, and everyone would get saved again, because you got to pad your numbers. And and without fail, for me, I was always feeling like I was constantly failing because I had these issues that were ongoing in my life. At the time as a kid, I was looking at porn, and I felt bad about it. And I was like, please, God, let your salvation take this time. Let me actually be saved this time. And they would always point it back to it's because you're listening to this secular music. And they'd be like, who loves Metallica? And I was like, yeah. And they were like, it's evil. And I'm like, no. So by the end of the night, we had these big bonfires, and everybody's burning their cassettes and their CDs. And without fail, there's some kid who's like, yeah, man, I could tell I was playing with the dark arts there. Heard a demon hiss when I burned my CD, and I was like, that's just plastic burning. That's what plastic does. And so for me, I had this experience of church and Jesus like I believed in airplanes. Everybody can look up in the sky and believe in airplanes. We don't doubt their existence, but it's a whole totally different thing to actually get on an airplane and trust the pilot to fly it. And so for me, I just kind of grew tired, and I outgrew this idea of being this moral person in order to get God to love me, and I was constantly blowing it. I was looking at pornography, I was drinking, I was hooking up, and I didn't know where to turn or how to talk to anybody because I would be judged or shamed for having these problems. And so eventually I walked out on my faith, but I just didn't tell anybody. Didn't tell my parents, didn't tell my friends. I just left. Thought it was all hogwash. And eventually, when I was 18, I enlisted in the military. And the military, of all places, was where I really got into pornography and got addicted. And you may think, that's a really weird place, the military, to get addicted to pornography. And so here's what happened. My teenage years and my childhood experience had this, experience in church. I lived a very good life. I had good parents that loved me. And I never really faced too much hardship except for bullying as a kid. But then September 11th hit. And I was sent to a small forward operating base on the Pakistani border. And there, I experienced hardship for the first time in my life. And while I was there, friends around me began to die. And I didn't know what to do with what I was seeing and the carnage and the wreckage. And I can still tell you, to this day, I can remember certain specifics, instances, firefights, watching friends bleed out, and it just destroyed me. And I would end up enduring 67 different attacks on the base that I was at. And on the 67th one was when I got wounded in action. And I ended up having to drag my friend to safety while we just bled all over the place. And because of those high-stress environments for a lot of us that are in the military, do you know what lonely men in high-stress environments do when they have no other outlet? We turn to pornography. It's easy, it's available, and it's everywhere for us. You have a hard day, you get in a firefight, you look at pornography. You get in a fight with your spouse or your girlfriend, you look at pornography. You want to escape. There's porn. And so eventually, after a decade of not attending church, my life just completely fell apart. I'd married my college sweetheart, and then I'd shipped off to Iraq. 3 months prior to coming home, I called home. She said she was leaving, and she had started seeing one of her coworkers. Now, this is not Emily, the girl that I'm married to now, who's helped me speaking, obviously. And so what happened after that is I went into full-blown meltdown. And I began to use porn at just every day, every night, because it was so lonely, and I felt so rejected, and the person that was supposed to love me the most had abandoned me. And the girls on the screen couldn't do that. Couldn't reject me, couldn't abandon me. And it became this patch for my loneliness and my isolation. And so I was living on my best friend's couch in Austin, Texas, and I'm just getting worse, and you can tell I'm growing more and more depressed. And he goes, "Hey man, can I take you to church?" And here's the weird part, he was an atheist. And like one of the militant types that's like, there is no God and I hate him. And I was like, dude, I don't get mad at unicorns and fairies. Like, why are you mad at something you don't believe in? It's just weird. But I ended up going with him. And for the first time in my life, I heard the gospel presentation. Not that you're good, but that you're not. And Christ loves you anyway. He wants to walk with you. You are not your past. You're not your now. You're not even your future. He sees the masterpiece that you are. And it blew me away. I was like, this is the core message of Christianity? This is awesome. And to make a long story short, I ended up meeting a guy who forever changed my life. It was a guy named Andy Baxter. And he would be the one who really began to walk with me through my pornography addiction. And this is him right there. But like most people who have a secret addiction, they're embarrassed. They feel shame. And I didn't know how to talk about the way that I was using porn. I didn't know how to talk about the way that I felt depressed, that I was using it to mask my emotions. And I thought, Christians are repressed. Of course, they're going to think that porn is like this big issue. But for me, I knew that I had a problem with it. And I remember the first time that Andy brought it up, I'd started serving in our youth group at our church. And he started talking about how he had struggled with it and how he was grieved about it. And at first I was like, oh, of course, that's what you would say. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We got to put values into these kids today. Ha ha. And then I realized he was serious. I was like, oh, okay, well, why? And he kind of just led me down this rabbit hole of information. He's like, dude, most of our society thinks that it's really not that big a deal. And the statistics these days will prove that. Look at this. Only half of adults today think that even viewing porn is wrong. Your teenagers think that not recycling is a bigger issue than online pornography. Not recycling. If I don't put my soda can in a recycling bottle, they're going to get more mad at me about that than viewing porn. 51% of teenage girls are viewing porn and 81% of teenage boys. These are our kids, and it's growing more and more normal. More and more and more. But here's the reality, porn is dangerous. And it's one thing to be misinformed, it's another thing to totally ignore the information and the cultural trend that we're seeing in society today. And in the book of Proverbs, King Solomon says, if you are wise, you will seek knowledge and you will seek to understand it because it will lead to life and you won't be complacent about it, but you'll find life. but when you ignore knowledge, you will find death. In fact, the opening verses in Proverbs say this. This is in Proverbs, the first chapter of Proverbs. It says, because they hated knowledge and they did not choose to fear the Lord, wouldn't have none of my counsel and despised my reproof. Therefore they shall eat the fruit of their ways and have their fill of their own devices. And we can see that really happening in our society today. For the simple are killed by turning away, and the complacency of fools destroys them. But whoever listens to me will dwell secure and will be at ease without dread of disaster. So this morning, if you have ears to hear, listen to wisdom. Listen to knowledge. Listen to what our society is seeing day in and day out. What our kids are seeing. How we're interacting with this. Because this information will lead you down a path that either leads to life, and ignoring it will lead to death. And that's the thing. I think as Christians, a lot of time, we fear good information, and we should not fear good information. So if you have ears to hear, listen. So first, let me just address the idea that porn is really not that big a deal, okay? Here's just the stats. Porn is a $97 billion industry worldwide. Hollywood makes 600 films a year that only make $10 billion. It exceeds the NFL, Major League Baseball, and basketball combined, as well as NBC, CBS, and ABC. It blows it out of the water. Not even close. Child porn generates $3 billion annually, and the number one search type of porn is teen. We want our pornography younger and younger. The average age a child will be exposed to pornography is now 11 years old. And mark my words, that will continue to drop. So yes, porn is a big deal, and we've normalized it. But here's where a lot of people want to argue with me. They go, well, I can handle it responsibly. You weren't able to, but I can view it responsibly. To which I say, no, you can't. It is the most online addictive thing that you can possibly do. And gambling is a distant second. Dutch researchers confirm this. And here's how I always debunk their claims. I tell guys this all the time. I go, do an experiment for me. Go a month without porn, if you can. And if you slip up, tell me. Then, if you do make it a whole month, tell me how hard it was. Those are the beginning signs of addiction right there. Anything you can't give up owns you. You're an addict. And listen, this isn't a men's issue anymore. This is a women's issue too. Do you remember that stat about teenage women wanting to seek out pornography? Do you know why? It's because porn neurologically rewires your brain for the way that you experience intimacy. It works like a twisted version of Pavlov's dog. Remember Pavlov's dog? You ring the bell, the dog salivates because it thinks it's getting a treat. It's the same way. When you view images online, it neurologically rewires your brain for the way that you're supposed to experience intimacy, and it's leading to all types of dysfunction. And they're dubbing it an arousal addiction. Whereas drugs and alcohol, you want more of the same. With pornography, you want different. And it always builds on itself, and because of the neural connections that is building between what you're seeing online and what's happening in your body, you'll move on to more increasingly extreme and deviant forms of pornography. That's why we have so many fetishes. And listen, you don't have to take my word for it, or psychologists or scientists' research, because there's a ton of information out there. Just listen to what Chris Rock had to say. Chris Rock recently did a Netflix special where he talked about how he blew up his marriage of 2 decades, was constantly running late for appointments because of his pornography addiction. Listen to what he says. When you watch too much porn, do you know what happens? You become like sexually autistic. You develop sexual autism. You have a hard time with eye contact and verbal cues. You get desensitized. When you start watching porn, any porn will do. Then later on, you're all messed up and you need the perfect porn cocktail to get aroused. And it messed me up so bad. In fact, studies will confirm this. In a 2012 survey of 1,500 men, 56% said their taste in porn had become increasingly extreme or deviant. Porn is teaching young women how they think that they should act in the bedroom or act in society. And I'm sure you've seen a lot in the news about sexual assault and the Me Too movement. What does porn have to do with that? Well, it's neurologically rewiring all of our brains to how we should objectify and think about the other person. What does porn play in this? Listen to this clip from an article of the Journal of Communication on pornography consumption and actual acts of aggression. They studied 22 studies, and they said there's little doubt that on average, individuals who consume pornography more frequently are likely to hold attitudes conducive to sexual aggression and engage in acts of sexual aggression. Porn is playing a big issue in today's sexual assault and rape culture. So maybe your eyes are opening a little bit, saying this is an issue. This is an issue in our church. It's an issue in our society. Maybe you're stuck. Maybe you're like, I know this information. I hate it. I want to quit, and I can't. And I'm so ashamed. First, I want to tell you, you're not alone. I was there. Even after I knew all this information, I found myself in a years-long battle. Years. But you know what changed me in the end? I'm not trying to fight this on my own. If you remember my friend Andy, when he began walking beside me, he didn't judge me. He didn't shame me. Instead, he restored me gently. When I fell down, he was there to carry me. When I wanted to give up, he cheered for me to go on. Because there were times where I thought, I'm never, ever going to beat this. And as I grew in my faith, I discovered something that Andy was teaching me. And it was directly out of our scriptures. It was in Galatians 6:1 and 2. And it says this in Galatians 6:1 and 2. Brothers, if anyone is caught in transgression, you who are spiritual, which was Andy for me, restore them in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. And that was so key. And that's the key to this verse. Gentleness, humility, being there to carry one another. If we cannot do this, people cannot be restored to the masterpiece that God sees them as. And if we want to have people change, if we want to change, we have to do it in these communities, and we have to begin to see people the same way that Jesus sees us. So imagine this for a moment. Imagine that you walk out of this place and you go over to the dumpster and you see a priceless Rembrandt painting in the dumpster covered in snow and mud and trash. How and what would you do with that painting? Would you break out a Brillo pad and start scrubbing it to get all that stuff off using coarse cleansing tactics and eventually write it off as a loss? Or would you gently and carefully remove the grime, being careful not to wound it, and take it to an expert? Of course you would. And that is the way that Jesus sees you and sees me. He does not see the mud. He sees the masterpiece underneath. And for those of us that are struggling, that's how he sees you. And that's how those of us who want to help should see them. So the key to breaking the cycle of addiction is restorative, gentle, confessional community. The 12 steps has nailed this for years, right? AA, SA, NA. Do you know what happens when you walk into 12-step? You go, hey, I'm an addict. My name's Ben. And they go, awesome. We're glad you're here. Do you know what happens when you relapse? They go, we're so glad you're here. Let's keep going. Nobody debates the effectiveness of 12 steps. We've been using it for years because it's restorative, non-judgmental community that restores people to their glory, their God-given glory. But anymore today, we like to hide behind our perfect veneers of Instagram and Facebook. We take selfies of ourselves looking like we're having the best time in our lives. But the studies don't lie. We're all lonely, and we know it. None of us take selfies of ourselves crying into pillows. When was the last time you did that? We all look perfect. And more we numb and isolate. We do it with pornography because we feel that rejection, that loneliness. We have this deep desire for community and emotional intimacies. We tell ourselves we have it because of our online personas. But that's not the case, is it? Like, nobody watches porn together. That's just weird. Hey guys, come on over. We're going to have some popcorn, pizza, and watch some porn. or watch it alone because it's a patch. And Johann Hari is a journalist and researcher who showed that this is the case, that disconnection leads to addiction. They did this really, really interesting study that he talks about in one of his books, where they take these rats and they would put them in cages. And this is how we got kind of like the war on drugs thing as far as everything that we know about drugs. And they would take this rat, put it alone in a cage, and give it regular water and cocaine water. Without fail, the rat would always drink the cocaine water and just kill itself. But what they realized is it was a rat alone in a cage, and its choices were to drink cocaine and feel better. So what they did instead is they took a ton of rats and all of their little rat buddies, and they stuck them in this little rat heaven where they could have friends and food and community. And they gave them regular water and cocaine water. Here's what's interesting. 90% of the rats did not drink the cocaine water. And the 10% that didn't use it habitually. You see, disconnection leads to addiction. But community leads to connection. And porn, I can tell you easily, especially after working with so many men, is more than just about feeling good. Underneath all of that, it's about loneliness, rejection, disconnection, isolation, fear of rejection, lack of emotional intimacy, and porn is the patch that many of us use for that disconnection. But we were never meant to live disconnected. We were never meant to hide from our weakest moments either and live in shame. There's this story in the book of John, in chapter 21, after Jesus' resurrection, where Peter, it tells us in the scriptures, he goes back to fishing. Jesus is dead, but he's resurrected, but Peter's like, I'm out. The Greek is very clear that he was going back to his old job. And he's out there with the other disciples, and he's fishing, and Jesus appears on the beach, and he yells out, hey, throw your nets to this side. And so they do, and Peter realizes that it's Jesus, and he jumps out of the boat, and he swims to shore. And as he's swimming to shore, Jesus builds a charcoal fire and starts cooking them breakfast. Now here's what's interesting. There are only 2 places in the Bible, in the Greek, where it has the word for charcoal fire. One is when Peter denies Christ 3 times. And the second one is when Jesus makes him breakfast on the beach. And when Peter appears and he shows up on that beach, Jesus asks him 3 questions. Simon, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Do you love me? The text is unbelievably clear in that moment. Jesus is leading Peter to his weakest moment. His weakest moment. And as Peter saw that fire and he heard those questions, I'm sure his heart sank. But here's the surprising part. Jesus doesn't leave him at failure. He instead reverses that failure into a commissioning, and he says, feed my sheep. You're the guy. You're the guy that's going to do it. Feed my sheep. Today, you may be feeling disconnected, alone, and maybe this talk is reminding you of your failure. Porn's been your secret. You use it, and like Peter, deny this problem or that you even use it. But Jesus is leading you to this moment here today. To stare at it face to face. And he doesn't have condemnation for you. Instead, he has hope. He has hope. He wants to remind you that your failure, your shortcomings were nailed to the cross with him. In his resurrection, just like he was showing Peter, he's reminding you that the second chances are infinite. Infinite. But first, you're going to have to confront it head on. You're going to have to confront it head on, and you're going to have to confront it in community, just like Peter did. Here's the interesting part about that story in Scripture. It's not just Peter and Jesus around that fire where he asks him those 3 questions and leads him to his weakest moment. You know who else is there? Doubting Thomas. If that's a key, I don't know what else is. Nathaniel, James, and John. It says 2 other disciples. And in the midst of that community, faced with his failure, Peter becomes the one on which Jesus says, you are going to be who I build my church on. You, the liar and the coward. I'm going to take you, and you're going to change the world. Are you faced with your charcoal fire today? Jesus, the people in this church, they want to help, and they're calling. Have you already faced your charcoal fire and found healing? Then help restore those that are facing theirs, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Let me pray. Jesus, we are so thankful for a church that's willing to address hard topics, and topics that many of us have run from in our own lives. And we know that this is a pervasive issue in our society anymore. And I know that there are people in this room, and the enemy is lying to them, telling them, run, get out of here, don't say anything, don't talk to your spouse, don't tell anyone, just, you got this. And instead, I pray that they would be courageous enough not to live in shame and condemnation, but boldly go forward and face their weakest moment head on, and realize that Jesus has not condemnation, but hope. I pray for those of us that hear those confessions, that we will restore them in a spirit of gentleness and humility and help bear that burden. I pray for spouses that will love their husbands. I pray for husbands that will love their wives and boyfriends and girlfriends and friends. Jesus, pour out your peace. We rebuke the enemy. We pray for courage today. In Christ's name.